Mormons at this time were radicals. So your question would have to be, whose phonics are going to win? The Civil War was really disruptive for people trying to start new things. Ordinary Mormons were struggling with the Deseret Alphabet. But spelling is hard. Hello there, welcome to the channel where we examine the weird and wonderful history of American religion. Now, it's just American religion for now, but we might branch out, but the reason why I'm starting there is because that's what I have all my degrees in, or at least most of them. So today we're going to talk about this. Today's story is the weird and wonderful tale of how 19th century Mormons attempted to literally rewrite the English language. So let's dive right in. Hi there, editing Religistorian here. This is the first video that I ever filmed, and I discovered when I was editing it that I had made some errors in my audio setup. I can assure you I was not banging a table, although I did have a section in this video where I was kind of clapping for some reason. I don't know why. Anyway, I did my best to clean up all of those strange, distracting noises and strange things, but at the same time, I was not able to make it, perfect. Perfection being the enemy of the good, and as much joy as I had doing the research for this video, I didn't want to delay it anymore, so it's just going to go out as is. I hope that you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed making it, and who knows, if I am well enough established on this platform at some point to get some better audio equipment, maybe I can re-record this and make it live up to the vision I had in my head. In any case, let's just get right back into the time the Mormons tried to rewrite the English language. In the 1830s, some people referred to the group that we're talking about today as Mormonites. And today, the largest group of them is known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But in the time that we're talking about, and throughout most of their history, they've been known as Mormons, and so that's what we're calling them today. There are a lot of groups that refer to themselves by different names, but are generally under the umbrella of Mormonism. Although the term Mormon may have been a pejorative when it was first used, it was, by the time that we're talking about, used both by the group themselves and others to refer to them. Mormons were originally followers of Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith had been a teenager in Western New York when he said he was visited by angels who commanded him to restore the true church. He said that an angel had led him to golden plates, which he translated with divine help from a language that he identified as Egyptian. We're going to skip over a whole lot of Mormon history now, and suffice it to say for our purposes that Joseph Smith had died and Brigham Young was leading the largest group of Mormons to a place in the West. Brigham Young brought Mormons to Utah. Mormons settled in Utah in 1847, and it's important to note that what they wanted to do was to set up a religious utopia. They wanted to reform absolutely everything about society. Mormons at this time were radicals in ways that we don't fully appreciate now if we know Mormons as sort of these mainstream conservative types. They were wanting to just upend everything and change everything at the time. So what does that have to do with language? Well, as I sort of hinted at with Joseph Smith, Mormonism is rooted in a fascination with language in many ways. Among Mormons, Joseph Smith is believed to have translated the scriptures that they have today, the Book of Mormon, etc., from a language called Reformed Egyptian. And Mormons also look forward to a future time when a pure language will be restored on the earth, called the language of Adam, or the Adamic language. And when things are restored to perfection again, then that's the language that all of us would be speaking. I'd also like to talk a little bit before we go into this, into the alphabet that we use today, because the alphabet we use is not the English alphabet, it's the Latin alphabet. The Latin alphabet, or the Roman alphabet, whatever you want to call it, brought to us by Romans from the ancient world. Well, it's used by more than 100 languages today all over the world. The alphabet that most of us use in the world, in fact, is the Roman or Latin alphabet. There are more than 100 languages that use it, and you can find it in North and South America, in Europe, and Oceania. You can also find this alphabet throughout most of Africa and parts of the Middle East. It's really, really dominant. In fact, if I manage to do this in the edits, you can see them scrolling by while I continue to talk about it. Although there are benefits from having a system like this, there are also drawbacks. A benefit is that if you wanted to learn a new language, you don't necessarily have to learn a new alphabet. But a key drawback to using the same alphabet for multiple languages is that the letters may not really accurately represent the sounds that they're meant to convey. It's not necessarily the case that T and H, if you thought about it too hard, would make a or the sound. So more than a few people have made new alphabets. Benjamin Franklin, in fact, made a new alphabet. Benjamin Franklin designed his alphabet in 1768. It uses the Roman alphabet for most of its letters, but it also incorporates a few new symbols. And Benjamin Franklin also helped persuade Noah Webster, who wrote one of the most popular dictionaries we still use today, to promote orthographic reform, meaning spelling reform, to change the way that people spell common words. These reforms are the reason why Americans spell color this way, C-O-L-O-R, and people elsewhere in the English-speaking world spell color C-O-L-O-U-R. There are examples of other languages where there have been successful efforts to reform a writing system. The Korean alphabet, or Hangul, was developed in the 15th century and was made official by decree of King Sejong in 1446. Previously, Korean was written using Chinese characters, which are symbols, but they're not phonetic. Hangul is an entirely phonetic system, and although it wasn't used by the upper classes until the mid-20th century, its use has been widespread and has totally reformed the way that people spell in Korean. It seems probable that the Mormons who wanted to reform written language in America were not familiar with King Sejong or Hangul, but they probably were familiar with Sequoyah. Sequoyah developed the Cherokee writing system by 1828, when Cherokee printing began. Unlike an alphabet, the Cherokee writing system is a syllabary. It uses symbols to represent individual syllables rather than individual letters representing individual sounds. But it is phonetic. Let's talk about some of the reform of the written language in English. In 1837, Isaac Pitman published stenographic soundhand in England. Soundhand we know better today as shorthand. You can't write down every word that I'm saying as quickly as I am saying it if you try to write it using the Roman or Latin alphabet, even if you write it in cursive or script. If you use shorthand, you can. Shorthand represents sounds rather than letters. You don't have to really know how to spell in order to use it. Shorthand quickly became very popular for use for journalists because you could transcribe speeches and debates and reprint them, and people could read about them from many miles away. You didn't necessarily have to attend an event to know what happened. Probably the best known example of journalists using shorthand in 19th century America to transcribe something was the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Abraham Lincoln debated Stephen Douglas in 1858, and the entire country was able to read what they said about whether slavery should be permitted in new states. Shorthand, in short, was revolutionary. I am the sort to make bad puns sometimes. Now, the first Mormon convert from England was George Darley Watt. Watt was baptized in 1837. After Watt's conversion to Mormonism, he immigrated to the United States to join with the major Mormon settlement, which was then in Nauvoo, Illinois. Watt had studied Pitman's shorthand system, and he used this skill as a church secretary in Nauvoo. Watt moved to Utah with Brigham Young and nearly all of the other Mormons in 1847. Brigham Young was president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that is to say, the Mormons, which constituted 99% of the population of Utah. Brigham Young wanted to convert the entire world, and he thought that reforming the system of language would help to do that. Young thought that written English was too challenging, especially for people who had limited educations or those for whom English was not their first language. One of the first things that Young wanted to do in the new Mormon utopia they were building was to have a solid educational system. In 1850, the General Assembly of the provisionally named State of Deseret, which we now know as Utah, established the University of Deseret. Now, the word Deseret appears in the Book of Mormon, and it means honeybee. We don't have time to get too deep into this right now, but suffice it to say that the honeybee was a symbol of industriousness and hard work, and so Mormons like to associate with it, and that's why so many things are named Deseret. You can still see this symbol on the state flag of Utah, which shows its lingering influence in the state, as well as the original name of the state. After Watt followed Brigham Young to Utah in 1847, he began teaching shorthand to church clerks. They were based in Salt Lake City. Young began taking an interest in the Pittman system, and Watt transcribed many of Young's sermons using shorthand. Meanwhile, there was another church leader, William W. Phelps, who proposed an alphabet distinct from the Pittman system as a replacement for the Latin alphabet. But Young was thinking it might be possible to keep a lot of the Latin alphabet and maybe just drop a few letters and add some more. Around this time, Young told the Board of Regents of the University of Deseret to establish a new system of orthography, that is, to establish a new way of spelling, or perhaps a new alphabet. Orthography is writing, spelling, it's the letters, etc. Near the end of December of 1851, Watt wrote about his concerns about some of the letters in the Latin alphabet. Particularly, he was concerned about C, S, and K. He used the words sight, and sent as an illustration of the point he had. At the time, Watt argued that the C should be eliminated from the alphabet entirely. By 1852, Young was fully convinced that shorthand was superior to ordinary written English. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is that it is phonetic, and obviously you can write more quickly, which people appreciated. You could transcribe things, but also it used less paper, which was significant in a really remote area. At the time where they were in Salt Lake City, it was 1,500 miles to the nearest supply depot, and one didn't cross 1,500 miles in an era before the automobile very quickly. Also, theoretically, if you had an entirely phonetic system, it would be possible to teach it to indigenous people. And the Native Americans you taught it to would be able to write to distant tribes and communicate with them. Many of the tribes at the time did not have a written system of language, and giving them a system of writing was supposed to be key to civilizing them. This was a common goal among people in America at the time, not necessarily just the Mormons, but Mormons definitely shared this goal. But back to Mormons reforming the alphabet. Young wrote about his frustrations with spelling in 1852. I have asked the Board of Regents to cast out from their system of education the present orthography and written form of our language, that when my children are taught the graphic sign for A, it may always represent that individual sound only. But as it is now, the child is perplexed that the sign A should have one sound in mate, a second sound in father, a third sound in fall, and a fourth sound in man, and a fifth sound in many, and, in other combinations, sounding different from these, while in others A is not sounded at all. I say, let it have one sound all the time. And when P is introduced into a word, let it not be silent, as in thistic, or sound like F in physic, and let two not be placed instead of one in apple. Now, Young may not have only been thinking of his own children when he was complaining about how difficult English was to learn, to write, and therefore to spell. Young boasted of only having had 11 days of formal schooling, and he was a notoriously bad speller. He relied on church clerks in order to handle his correspondence. Another Mormon, John Vance, presented a new system of writing to the University of Deseret's Board of Regents in 1853. Vance's alphabet made some symbols that would stand in for the sounds represented by the Latin alphabet in English by more than one letter, i.e., if you think about TH and sounds like the and the, you would have a different symbol in Vance's alphabet. But the Board of Regents could not really agree on a path forward. There was an ongoing debate at the time about whether it was better to reduce the number of letters or simply represent each sound with a new symbol. Finally, in October of 1853, they appointed a 3-person committee to create a primer on an entirely phonetic alphabet. This committee included Herbert C. Kimball, who was president of their upper house of the Territorial Assembly, Parley Parker Pratt, who was known and is known as the Apostle Paul of Mormonism, and Watt himself. On November 24th, 1853, the Deseret News, which was the only newspaper in Salt Lake City and also the official mouthpiece of the Mormon Church, reported on this development. We have observed the frequent sittings of the board of late that has the fatherly supervision of education in the territory of Utah, and are happy to learn that their discussions are calculated to call forth a searching investigation into the elementary sounds of language and also into the nature and structure of such characters as are employed to express the radical and multiplied sounds of language. The editorial in the Deseret News said that this was an opportunity to create a universal language that would represent all human sounds. It included the claim that every nation and language will forthwith understand them, meaning that these symbols could be used by anyone, anywhere. Now, if you know very much about language, you know that's probably too ambitious because there are a lot of sounds in English that are not represented in other languages, but so is vice versa. There are many sounds in other languages that are not represented in spoken English. So if you were to develop an alphabet based solely on phonetic spelling of English, you would leave a lot of things out, and it could not possibly represent all human sounds, all sounds that you might make when you were speaking whatever languages you speak. Watt developed an alphabet that consisted of 40 letters, and the Board of Regents ultimately accepted 38 of them. They left out one that represented a diphthong, the U in mule, and another diphthong, oi in oil. A diphthong is a vowel sound that is a transitional one. So basically the transition between two vowel sounds. So mule is U, so E, U, U, and oi is oi, oi. So you see the sounds can be represented by putting letters together because a diphthong is not an individual sound. So please have fun practicing that wherever you are so that I'm not the only one looking really silly right now. The alphabet retained some Latin letters, as Young had originally suggested, ironically, including some that Watt originally said he didn't want. So the letters that were included in the new alphabet that had been in the Roman alphabet were O, C, D, S, and L. Watt based the rest of the letters on Pitman shorthand or symbols that appeared from classical alphabets is detailed in Webster's dictionary. On January 19, 1854, the Deseret News announced that a new alphabet had been approved and adopted. The orthography will be so abridged that an ordinary writer can probably write 100 words a minute with ease and consequently report the speed of a speaker without much difficulty. In the new alphabet, each letter has a fixed and unalterable sound. By this method, strangers can not only acquire a knowledge of our language much more readily, but a practiced reporter can also report a strange language when spoken. The committee was pleased with their work. They felt that they had captured all human sounds. Parley P. Pratt wrote to Orson Pratt on January 30th, 1854. This alphabet will write Spanish, Hebrew, Greek, and with the addition of a few more letters, all the languages of the earth. That is not a typo. He did spell alphabet with an F, which maybe drives home the point a little. Spelling is not easy. Now, it's not enough just to have an alphabet, but you have to also get people to use it. So the next push was for public acceptance. Young sent Watt out on a lecture tour to emphasize the usefulness of the new alphabet. And the University of Deseret also made plans to publish in it. There were outsiders, however, who expressed skepticism. My personal favorite of these appeared in the San Francisco Globe on December 15th, 1857. The Mormons are a progressive people. They not only want more wives than is wholesome, but more letters to their alphabet. Letters written with this alphabet are as incomprehensible as the movements of woman or the hieroglyphics of the Chinese and the Egyptians. The Mormon alphabet consists of about 40 letters, which have been so arranged and named to cause the greatest possible annoyance to outsiders. The saints not only wish to convert Utah into an oyster, but to close the shell against all knives except those found in the vicinity of Great Salt Lake. The Mormons wish to isolate the generation of vipers which are to succeed them. For this reason, they wish to get up a new alphabet, a new spelling book, a new language. The idea is ingenious, but it will not succeed. To get a new language in this country is as difficult as to bore a hole through the Rocky Mountains with a leather auger. We do not, in this video, have the room or space or time to talk about polygamy. Suffice it to say that that is a reference to Mormons practicing polygamy, and if that's something that you want to know more about, let me know. The alphabet hit a snag in 1857 when the U.S. Army was sent to Utah to put down a rebellion. The Mormons fought to prevent the Army from taking over. The truce was reached in the so-called Utah War in 1858. This is another thing that we don't have time to talk about, but we could if you were interested. But we're glossing over it. We're moving on. The Board of Regents then turned back to the business of printing. In 1859, Mormon missionaries to the Hopi people began writing their journals in the alphabet known as the Deseret Alphabet. Marion J. Shelton, one of these missionaries, wrote about it in that November. I employ my time in studying the language and instructing them in the Deseret Alphabet. I find that I acquire the language very readily, and those to whom I have given lessons have taken right hold to the alphabet. So the Deseret Alphabet was the way that people were learning to write in Hopi. Apologies everyone if things look a little different. My camera overheated and I had to give it a chance to take a break. And I took a break too, so I think things are pretty much what they were before, but if something has changed, that would be why. So as I was saying, there are various articles and other publications that began using the Deseret Alphabet, including the Deseret News. When John T. Morris died in 1855, his headstone was written in Deseret. And in 1860, a new $5 coin was minted using the Deseret characters. And then the Civil War happened. The Civil War was really disruptive for people trying to start new things. But it was also really challenging to have a phonetic text at all, which, if you think about it, is not that hard to understand. Pratt and most of the board was from New England. Watt was an immigrant from England, as we said before, Northwest England specifically. There was a board member from Tennessee and one from Scotland. And these people were trying to agree on how to spell things strictly phonetically. So your question would have to be, whose phonics are going to win? I say things differently than my friends in Yorkshire do. And I say things differently than people from other parts of America do. So who would win if you were trying to say what I said phonetically? Well, they come up with a solution. In 1869, the Board of Regents succeeded in publishing a primer, the first part of the Book of Mormon, and ultimately the entire Book of Mormon in Deseret. Now, how did they do that? Ultimately, the group settled on using Webster's 1864 Complete Dictionary of the English Language as authoritative for pronunciation. So what we see, for the most part, in the text that they published is a consistency in spelling, which is not something you would really expect from a phonetic text. When they published a strictly phonetic book, then they were also dictating the accent. People would have to read it and read it through the sound that it produced, and if the sound that it produced wasn't the sound that they would produce, they would just have to understand the accent that was being used. So why Webster? Webster wasn't Mormon, but his dictionary was considered authoritative throughout most of America for the way that English should be spelled and spoken. Webster was considered an absolute authority on American English in general. And still, not everything was consistent in the documents that the group prepared. How do you say this word? You might say blessed. You might say blessed. Well, it depends to us and to them, right? Because blessed is something we would normally see in, say, the King James Version of the Bible, and therefore, blessed are the peacemakers. Something similar happened with the Book of Mormon. But you might say, I am blessed. You really blessed me. As opposed to, I am blessed. You have blessed me. Those sorts of things, right? As we understand it in terms of modern English, it's blessed, and that's really a T sound instead of an ed sound, even though it's spelled with the ed. They use different versions of this in different parts of the Book of Mormon. In Jacob 6:3, they wrote, how blessed are those who have labored. But in Mosiah 2:41, they chose consider on the blessed and happy state. But this wasn't the only challenge they had. At the time of publication, the typesetter made a lot of mistakes that needed to be corrected. So the books weren't ready for distribution yet. It turns out that these 4 volumes, published in 1868, were the only books ever published in the Deseret Alphabet. The volumes that were published were never used. So why might that have been? Well, ordinary Mormons were struggling with the Deseret Alphabet. As we said before, it isn't enough to establish an alphabet, you need people to use it, and public support was something that the Deseret Alphabet never really got. So what they said about why it was difficult was that there was no distinction between the capital letter and the lowercase letter except the size. There was also no script form of the letters, so you would spend a lot more time writing them than you would spend even writing English in cursive, but especially more time than you would be spending if you were writing in shorthand. Everybody had to write in block letters. Another thing that you might observe if you're looking at text written in Deseret is that there are no lines that extend above or below the main part of the letter, meaning it's all just one big block of text. This was a deliberate choice. It was cheaper. So if you made a typeset that had the letters with pieces extending above and below the line, those tended to wear out faster. Given the distance from the supply depot and the cost associated with creating an entirely new typeset, they concluded that it was best to be both economical and practical and design a type that would not wear out as quickly. Another thing people complained about was that Deseret substituted new letters where the original Latin alphabet probably would have worked. These two things taken together drastically reduced the readability of the Deseret text for those who had already learned to read and write in the Roman or Latin alphabet. There are researchers who say, and haven't proven it yet, but they say, that we don't actually read each individual letter, but that our brains decode words based on rough shapes and that sort of thing, and that we will be slowed down if those shapes look too much alike. I don't know if that's the case, but that could be another thing that would have contributed to Deseret being just flat out harder to read in general and not harder to read on the basis of what you already knew. I am not a linguist, and I can only tell you what the people themselves were saying. The Mormon magazine Juvenile Instructor outlined the problems with the Deseret alphabet on October 2nd, 1875, and explained why Brigham Young didn't feel that the system was working out. There being no shanks to the letters, all being very even, they are trying to the eye because of their uniformity. Another objection some have urged against them has been that they are entirely new, and we should have characters as far as possible with which we are familiar, and they have felt that we should use them as far as they go, and adopt new characters only for the sound which our present letters do not represent. The Juvenile Instructor recommended using the Pitman shorthand system instead. But that really didn't gain traction either. Young died in 1877. This entire experiment was over. The Deseret alphabet essentially died with Brigham Young. But I want to talk a little bit about the legacy of the Deseret alphabet and what we can learn from it. This alphabet that Watt developed gives us insight into the accents that people had in Utah at the time that he was writing it. Some say the alphabet itself explains why the people of Utah don't pronounce OR words like corner, horse, and store the same way as other people tend to. This is called the chord-card merger, meaning this is a chord and this is a card, and this is a car, and this is a core, and this is a store, and this is a star, and this is a hort, and this is a harse, and these are Mormons. It could be that Watt was reflecting what he was hearing around them instead of just imposing a pronunciation on them. Watt was from England, and people in England, so far as I know, don't say things like Carner. But the cool thing is that because the alphabet was phonetic, we know how people spoke. We know what they sounded like if they were writing in Deseret. I have been saying Deseret and Deseret alphabet throughout this video. It is the way people say that word today. But they didn't say it that way. At least that's not how they wrote it in the Deseret Alphabet. It seems that they pronounced it Deseret. So, Deseret, not Deseret. And for them, it would have been the Deseret Alphabet. A lot of speculation has occurred about why the Mormons attempted to rewrite the English language. So let's go over those reasons together. There are some who suspected that Mormons were developing a secret code, basically to prevent people from learning church secrets. Now, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and other Mormon groups are a secretive people. You do not necessarily know, even if you are a Mormon, what happens in Mormon temple rituals until after you have experienced them, because unlike most of the religious groups you may be familiar with, Mormons are secretive about what takes place and about many of their beliefs. But this isn't actually plausible as a reason why the Deseret Alphabet was established. And one of the main reasons that we know this is because you could easily buy a key to the alphabet for 10 cents for anyone. This explanation is also especially implausible when you think about their stated goal to evangelize the whole world and to have a means for communication across language groups and make it easier for people to communicate with each other. Some say that it was to keep Mormons from reading unapproved literature. Although it does not seem that Watt and those involved in the project were seeking to prevent people from being able to read in the Latin or Roman alphabet. If people weren't able to read the texts that were produced by other groups, then you would have pretty strict control over what information people could receive. It might have been viewed as a benefit. On August 13, 1868, the Deseret News said this was one of the reasons to adopt a new system of writing. The greatest evils which now flourish, and under which Christendom groans, are directly traceable to the licentiousness of the press. It sends forth a prurient and dangerous literature, which corrupts and distorts the minds and judgments of men. It is our aim to check its demoralizing tendencies, and in no way can we better do this than by making the knowledge of the Deseret Alphabet general and by training the children in its use. People in the 19th century were reforming spelling and wanting more phonetic ways to communicate. Within this context, it's possible we can think of Mormons as simply being part of a fad. They just got caught up in the moment. But spelling is hard, and it's difficult for me to convey this to you if you did not really experience this when you were growing up. The only way that you knew how to spell a word definitively was to look it up in the dictionary. But the problem with this, as children of my generation will tell you, is that you have to know how to spell a word to look it up, so it could get quite tricky. Now, this was also a problem compounded by the realities of life on the 19th century frontier. Most people would not have a dictionary at home, and instead they would need to go to a school to access one. So spelling is hard, English spelling particularly so, and finding out how to spell things can be hard to do. I will quote Mormon leader George Albert Smith on this topic. I hardly dare write a letter now without consulting the dictionary to see how some word or other should be spelled. The spelling of the English language is very arbitrary. Many Mormon leaders thought that it was easier to learn English with a different alphabet. Immigrants did find that it was easier to learn, and because Mormons believed that God himself had chosen to reveal himself in the English language, at least to aid Joseph Smith in translating from a reformed Egyptian language into English, then people needed to be able to learn it in order to access the scriptures. It may also reflect back on that Mormon fascination with language we've discussed earlier. As I said, Mormons looked forward to a future time when the language of Adam, or the pure language of the past, would be restored on the earth. In one of the Mormon scriptures, the Book of Moses, it is said that Adam's children taught their own children to read and write, having a language that was pure and undefiled. Young often spoke of a time he hoped this pure language would be restored. So Mormon fascination with language and a hope to restore a pure and undefiled language leads to wanting to purify English. Today, most people think of Mormons as conservative and mainstream, which might surprise the Mormons that we're talking about today. It may be the case that most Mormons today, especially the largest group, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints based in Salt Lake City, are pretty much mainstream and conservative. But these Mormons of the 19th century were seeking to totally upend society. They wanted to change everything. They were building a utopia, a world free from the influences of the corruptions of the outside. We often see that when a religious group survives a few generations, it changes a lot from its radicalism. It can transform into something more mainstream, which is really what we see among Mormons, or it can just sort of peter out, as we see among Shakers. I don't really know why they did it ultimately, but whatever the fate of the Deseret Alphabet, I can be assured and confident, I am confident in saying this, Brigham Young would appreciate spell check and autocorrect. These things are bringing us to a more pure world. Can't imagine what he'd think about auto-translate. So thank you so much for joining me today and for making it all the way to the end. I deeply appreciate each and every person who has chosen to watch this video, whether I sent you a link myself or you found it on your own. I have a lot of other stories to tell, so if you want to hear about them, you can, of course, subscribe and click on the notification bell to get notified if I post a new video. Until next time, I will say to you, my imaginary friends, please stay well and stay curious. Bye-bye. Coming soon on the Religistorian. What is the American God? Well, that's complicated. So let's talk theisms.